So now let's do a review of homework exercise 13. And in this exercise, it requires you to do translations from natural language into standard logical form for two-term statements. As the directions say, read each of the following sentences, then translate each sentence into standard logical form. That is, reconstruct the sentence as a two-term statement. To do this, you'll need to figure out A, what is the subject term class? B, what is the predicate term class? C, is the statement universal or particular? And D, is the statement affirmative or negative? That is, does it affirm or deny a class inclusion? All of your answers, written as complete two-term statements, should be in one of the standard forms we learned in the recorded lecture on two-term statements, which is the universal affirmative, universal negative, particular affirmative, or particular negative. And then note also, some exercise items are not easy tasks. In other words, some of these sentences are deliberately challenging and meant to create questions and puzzles for you to figure out. So if you didn't get them all when you attempted them, do as many as you can and learn from the review here. So number one, we'll start with an easier one based on a popular slogan in American politics today, Black Lives Matter. And so in this case, again, what we want to know is what's the subject term, what's the predicate term, what's the quality of the statement, and what is the quantity of the statement. So in this case, obviously, the subject term is Black Lives, right? So one way to do this would be to bracket the subject term and then also the predicate term. And I like to put in a noun with the predicate term if it's just an abstract idea, as it is in this case. So we could say people or lives that matter. And so we'll bracket the predicate term. So we have the subject term and the predicate term. Now we need to figure out whether the statement is affirmative or negative and whether it is universal or particular. So we are saying Black Lives Matter. That's an affirmative statement, right? So in other words, we are saying all Black lives are in the category of people or lives that matter. And as I just indicated, it's also universal because we're not just talking about some Black lives, but all of them. So we have a universal affirmative statement. So just to note that here, we'll put the UA, it's a universal affirmative. So the final translation would be all Black lives are people or lives that matter. I typically like to use a noun that's different than the noun in the subject term when I'm adding that noun into the predicate term. But as long as it's clear what you've indicated about which is the predicate term, which is the subject term, then we're not going to worry too much about that. So number two, unsolicited manuscripts will be returned when accompanied by a stamped self-addressed envelope. Unsolicited manuscripts will be returned when accompanied by a stamped self-addressed envelope. So a couple of things we can note here. We have the will be. That implies an affirmative statement. What will be? Well, the subject term is unsolicited manuscripts, right? However, notice there's additional information that qualifies the subject term category. It's not just unsolicited manuscripts, but they have to be accompanied by a stamped self-addressed envelope, right? And so when we have additional information like this, a qualifying phrase, for instance, right, we want to include all of that information to help us be precise about the category. So in this case, what we could do is move that additional information into the subject term category. Unsolicited manuscripts accompanied by a stamped self-addressed envelope. All of that is the subject term. Then it says will be returned. What will be returned? Well, the manuscripts, right? So we'll just call that returned manuscripts. And that's the predicate term. Get rid of the when. Unsolicited manuscripts accompanied by a stamped self-addressed envelope will be returned. In other words, are returned manuscripts. And are we talking about all unsolicited manuscripts or some? Well, it might be some unsolicited manuscripts if we don't include the additional qualifying adjectival information. But once we do, we can make a universal statement about it, because we're talking about all unsolicited manuscripts with the self-addressed envelope are returned manuscripts. So we have another universal affirmative here, and we construct that with the all are form. Number 3, not every dog has its day. So in this case, there's a good clue right at the beginning, not. So it tells us it's very likely a negative statement, and not every, right, means less than every, that is fewer than every. And so we have a particular statement. So this is a good indication that this is going to be a particular negative statement. And we would reconstruct that or translate that as some dogs are not, and again we use a noun, creatures perhaps, or animals that have their day. Number 4, all those who testified before the committee were granted immunity except those who had already been convicted. So again, we have some clues here, all those, which tells us this is very likely a universal affirmative statement. So let's start with that hypothesis at least, a universal affirmative. And then we have to find the subject term and the predicate term. So the subject term, all those who testified before the committee were, so we would change that to are, people granted immunity. And then what do we do with this extra information? Because actually it isn't all people who testified, it's all people who testified and had not been convicted, right? And that is what allows us, when we include all of that information, just as we did in item number 2, when we include all that information to be more precise in defining the subject term, then we can make a universal statement about that subject term class. So we would eliminate this here and draw it in here by saying, and who had not previously been convicted. All of that is the subject term. So the subject term, those who testified before the committee and had not been previously convicted, are the people who are granted immunity, and a universal affirmative statement. So let's move to number 5. You won't find any wild-eyed radicals in this student body. Now, this should be a pretty easy one. You see the won't, right, which tells you it's very likely a negative statement, and any, which tells you it's universal. So we would have a universal negative statement. So what would be the subject and the predicate term here? We would have wild-eyed radicals would be the subject term, and why don't we call them scholars in this student body, or members of the student body, right? Then we just have to replace the natural language with the standard logical form. No wild-eyed radicals are scholars or members of this student body. And then you have your universal negative. By the way, and then we'll learn this in a couple of lessons coming up, universal negative statements are convertible. And by convertible, we mean with universal negatives, and also, by the way, with particular affirmatives, you can switch the position of the subject term and the predicate term and have a logically equivalent statement. So if you answered number 5 by saying no people in the student body or no scholars in the student body or no members of the student body are wild-eyed radicals, that's also a perfectly correct answer because it's a logically equivalent statement to the way I've done it here. Number 6, no one was admitted to the convention floor without an identification card, right? So again, you're translating the natural language. This sentence makes sense in natural language, but we need to put it in standard form, so we have to move around some of the information, right? No one was admitted to the convention floor without an identification card. So let's take that without identification card, because again, it helps us be precise about the subject term. So we would say no person without an identification card are people admitted to the convention floor as the predicate term. Pretty obvious this is another universal negative statement because we begin with the word no already in the natural language statement, and that's the good clue. That's a universal negative. So no person without an identification card are people admitted to the convention floor. And again, you could convert this if you did it, no person admitted to the convention floor are people without an identification card, then that's fine too. Number 7, so here's a trickier one. She never does homework on Sunday. She never does homework on Sunday. And this is tricky because your instinct at first is to say, okay, she must be the subject term because she is the subject of the sentence, but it doesn't mean it's the subject term of the logical statement. And the way you figure this out is to think about what's the universe of discourse here, okay? Because the key idea is sharing information about which days this person does homework. So the universe of discourse is effectively days of the week, okay? So we have Sundays and we have days that she does homework on. And so actually when we think about this, she, though it's the subject of the sentence, right? She is part of the subject term that refers to days on which she does homework. So because we're working within that universe of discourse, which is days of the week. And so when we understand that, we could then sort of reframe or translate the statement, in this case, as a universal negative, because never tells us it's both universal and negative, right? So we would make it as no Sundays are, I'm just going to call them homework days. In other words, no Sundays are days on which she does homework, and that would be the translation into standard logical form with Sundays as the subject term and homework days as the predicate term. But again, because it's universal negative, you could say no homework days are Sundays, and that would be perfectly acceptable. Now, when I'm talking about conversion, just to be sure, you can do this with universal negatives and also with particular affirmatives, but you cannot do that with universal affirmatives or particular negatives because you would not then have a logically equivalent statement. So we move on to number 8, and now we have a little bit more information, and it complicates our translation a bit more. So we still have she never does homework on Sundays unless the horoscope is favorable. So how do we translate the word unless? We still want to recognize, first of all, that never tells us it's still universal negative, right? Universal negative. So we still have the same universe of discourse, days of the week, but now we're being even more precise about what kind of days we're talking about. And the key here is to understand how to translate the word unless. When you see unless, especially when you see unless in deductive reasoning, and this will be especially important when we get to conditionals, read unless as if not. If not, okay? So that tells us there are certain days that she does homework and doesn't do homework, and it depends on her horoscope. So we say she never does homework on Sunday unless, that is, if not, that is, if the horoscope is not favorable. So we could translate this as, and I'll do it here underneath, right? No, in this case, we'll do homework days first as the subject term. No homework days are, and then the predicate term, Sundays without favorable horoscopes. Okay. And in this case, too, you could convert this. You could say, no Sundays without favorable horoscopes are homework days. And that would give you the natural language statement in standard logical form. Number 9. Into each life, a little rain must fall. So there's a couple of really good clues here. We look at the beginning of the natural language sentence, into each. Into tells you this statement affirms a class inclusion, and each tells you it's universal. So those good clues at the beginning identify the statement as a universal affirmative, and we would translate this as all lives are, and again, throw in a noun. Sometimes it makes the standard logical form statement, it makes the two-term statement a bit awkward, but it helps us to remember that we're talking about terms that represent physical categories in the real world, right? So existences or something like that, into which rain must fall, or something along those lines. Again, your reconstruction of the term or your abbreviations may be slightly different than mine. That doesn't matter as long as it's clear what the statement is and what the subject term and predicate term are. That is, what kind of a statement it is and what's the subject term and the predicate term. Number 10, there are those who have dropped out of college and returned to get a degree. There are those who have dropped out of college. There are those, right? There's a clue here. It seems to suggest that we're not talking about everyone, but some among a category, right? And so we have a particular statement. And what do we say about those who have dropped out of college, which seems to be the subject term here, right? What do we say? Some of them are, right, people who return to get a degree. Now the question is it affirmative or negative? There are those, right? That's an affirmative statement. So some, we'll call this some students who have dropped out of college are people who returned to get a degree. Some, or you could just say some dropouts are people who return to get a degree. But we have the subject term and the predicate term and a particular affirmative statement. Again, because it's particular affirmative, you could, although it would be kind of awkward in this case, but you could convert it. You could say some people who return to get a degree are students who dropped out of college, and that would be logically equivalent and so acceptable. Number 11. Now this is probably the most challenging or difficult of all of the items on the exercise. So if you did this one correct, good for you. And if not, don't be too stressed about it. It's meant to be especially challenging. So this is a couple of lines from a poem, which we'll take all together as one two-term statement when we translate it. Not through eastern windows only, when morning comes in the light. And the tricky part here is not really figuring out this quantity and quality, because there's a clue here, not through only, okay? And so not tells us it's negative, and the not only tells us it's probably particular. So we can begin with the hypothesis, this is a particular negative. So if it's not only, that is, it's less than all, so that would be particular, and the not tells us it's negative. But then the tricky part here is trying to figure out what is the subject term and what is the predicate term. And so it helps to try to imagine what is the proper universe of discourse. That is, what is the universe of discourse that contains all of the relevant terms and their complements? What are the categories that we are working in here? And the best clue about that is right here, where we have a clear noun, eastern windows, all right? So windows is in general, windows is the universe of discourse, different types of windows. So we have eastern windows here as one of our terms, but then we have this other part of the poem which just says, when morning comes in the light. So what do we do about that? Well, if you're thinking about, for instance, if you're in a house, how does light come in? It comes in through the windows. And so we could think about, if we have eastern windows as one of our categories, we could have morning light windows, right? Because we're talking about the light coming in through windows, morning light windows as the other category. And then, of course, because this is written in poetic language, it may not necessarily follow that that means we have our subject and predicate term in that order. And in fact, if you actually think what the poem is saying, not through eastern windows only when morning comes in the light, right? It actually makes more sense to switch the positions of the terms as they appear in the natural language or poetic sentence, so that they're in a different position in the two-term logical statement, right? So the best way to do this then, keeping it as a particular negative, would be, and again, what you're trying to do with the standard logical form statement is to precisely express the relationship between the two terms with regard to affirming or denying a class inclusion, and then also determining if we're talking about all or some, right? So in this case, we have what we thought was a particular negative. So let's start there. Somewhat. Morning light windows are not eastern windows. Okay? And if you think about this and go back and look at the original poetic statement, which is not through eastern windows only when morning comes in the light, right? That's expressed logically as some morning light windows are not eastern windows. In other words, some of the windows through which you get light in the morning are other than eastern windows, because when the sun comes up, even there are windows that face the east, and the light comes in those windows, but it also comes in all the other windows facing north, south, and west as well, right? And so that's why it's correct to say some morning light windows are not eastern windows, particular negative in standard logical form. Number 12, honest politicians, certainly they exist. So here we have actually two sentences in natural language. We're going to make this into one standard logical form, two-term statement. The first sentence is a question, it says certainly they exist. Who's the they? Honest politicians, because that was the term used in the question. Certainly they exist. And to suggest that they exist doesn't mean that every one of the politicians we're talking about is honest, but we know that the person making a statement like this or answering this question in this way believes there's at least one honest politician. And noting that they exist, that's an affirmative. So we would identify this as a particular affirmative statement, and we would turn it in standard logical form to some politicians are honest people. And there's your particular affirmative in standard logical form. Number 13, all that glitters is not gold. All is not, all right? Now, in natural language, that's perfectly acceptable, but of course you can't use all is not in standard logical form, even though there's a temptation to make universal negatives using all or not or all is not. Don't do that because it creates a logically ambiguous statement. So all that glitters is not gold. And you think about this, does that mean nothing that glitters is gold? No, it doesn't mean a universal negative. It means there are things that glitter that are non-gold things, right? So there's a couple of ways you could do this. It is a negative, right? Because we have the not. And because we're talking about less than all the things that glitter, it's also particular. So we would start with the particular negative hypothesis, and we could say some glittering things are not gold things or gold objects. Let's use a different noun here. Okay. And that would be standard logical form for the particular negative. However, and I think in this case especially, it would be all right to obvert that statement, and we'll learn about obversion later, but perhaps you've done it this way, just thinking about it naturally in your own reasoning capacity. So if you were to say some glittering things, are non-gold objects, then that would be perfectly acceptable too. What you've done is you've replaced the original predicate term with its complement, but in doing that, you've also changed the quality of the whole term, of the whole statement, I mean. And in fact, if you make a Venn diagram of my first answer here, some glittering things are not gold objects, that Venn diagram would match exactly the Venn diagram that you would create for the second of the answers here. They would be identical because the two statements are logically equivalent. So either of those answers would be correct. Number 14, none of the trustees who were appointed by the governor will vote for the contract. So there's a good clue here, none, right? None tells us this is going to be a universal negative statement. And then we just simply have to figure out what are the subject terms and what's the subject term and the predicate term. So we have no, and then the subject term is trustees, but not just any trustees, trustees appointed by the governor, right? That's all that is the subject term. And what do we say about them? That is, what is the predicate term? They are voters for the contract, right? Or people who will vote for the contract or something like that. So in this case, we have no trustees appointed by the governor are people who will vote for the contract or voters for the contract or contract supporters. Or again, you can use a different expression as long as it's clear that we're talking about the same predicate term. So universal negative. And again, because this is a universal negative, you could, if it came out that way, you could convert the statement. You could say no supporters of the contract are trustees appointed by the governor, and that would be equally correct. And now number 15, the last one, this is a little bit tricky too. The books that were not banned were the books that nobody read. The books that were not banned are the books that nobody read. Now, what's confusing about this is that it seems to operate in an interesting universe of discourse where there's both terms and their complements at work at the same time. So let's try to figure this out. We have were, right? And so that tells us this is affirmative. That is, the main verb in the statement is affirmative. So we have an affirmative statement. Then we're talking about the subject term, the books that were not banned, right? All of that is the subject term. And what do we say about them? They were or they are. And then books that nobody read. So are we talking about all the books that were not banned, or are we talking about some of them? It seems to suggest it's universal, the books, because we don't get any indication that we're talking about just some of them, right? So all the books that were not banned are books that nobody read. You could also be a little more precise, or maybe precise is not the best word. You could also be a little bit more efficient. And instead of saying the books that were not banned, because if you keep that not in there, you might lead yourself into some confusion thinking it's a negative statement. And to avoid that, you could just change this into all non-banned or even unbanned books. But all non-banned books are, and again, you could be really efficient here and just say unread books. Right? All non-banned books are unread books, a universal affirmative. So that's a review of the examples on exercise 13, translating from natural language to standard logical form. Continue to practice this, and you can use any text that you deal with on a regular basis. You can take transcripts from your conversations. You can look at editorials in the newspaper. You can look at sentences in your textbooks and just translate them into standard logical form, because we will continue to use this skill throughout the remainder of the semester as we deal first with logical equivalence and logical relations, and then also when we get into constructing syllogisms and then generating and finding missing premises in natural language arguments. So this is a fundamental kind of skill to develop. So you want to master this skill and be able to continue to apply that kind of analysis to the discourses that we read throughout the remainder of the semester. So if you have any questions on any of the items here or on the process of doing this translation to standard logical form, please post them to the discussion board.